In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to valleys that time seems to have abandoned, there exists a documented case that has puzzled historians for nearly 2 centuries. In 1834, the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, a community so isolated that maps of the era barely acknowledged its existence. What happened during their 3-day stay was meticulously recorded in the personal journal of Pastor William Phillips, a document discovered in 1987 when the old church was finally demolished. The journal entries describe events so precise, so unnaturally accurate, that modern psychologists have studied them extensively. Yet none can explain how 2 young children could possess knowledge that defied every rational explanation. The Morrison twins didn't just predict future events. They revealed secrets buried for decades, described people they'd never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred years before their birth. But perhaps, most unsettling of all, every single detail they revealed proved to be absolutely, verifiably true. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Before we dive deeper into the Morrison case, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to uncover details that most historians refuse to discuss. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Because what happened in Kentucky might have happened closer to your home than you think. The story begins not with the supernatural, but with something far more unsettling: the possibility that some human minds can access information in ways science still cannot comprehend. The Kentucky of 1834 was a land caught between wilderness and civilization, where communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual isolation among the Cumberland foothills. This particular settlement had been established in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom away from the denominational conflicts plaguing larger towns. By the time the Morrison family arrived, Pine Hollow consisted of barely 200 souls, most related by blood or marriage, all bound by the strict Baptist doctrine that governed every aspect of their daily lives. The community centered around a modest wooden church built with their own hands using timber from the surrounding hills. Pastor William Phillips, a learned man who had abandoned his comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls, maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and significant events. His meticulous nature would prove crucial in documenting what was about to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar figure along the circuit of remote churches scattered throughout the Appalachian region. Tall and weathered, with prematurely gray hair that spoke of hardships beyond his 34 years, he traveled on foot with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather satchel containing his Bible, a few personal items, and the journal where he recorded his spiritual observations. He had been widowed for 9 years, ever since his wife Sarah died giving birth to the twins during a terrible winter storm that had isolated their cabin for weeks. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were striking in their identical appearance yet completely different in temperament. Rebecca, born first by mere minutes, possessed an outgoing nature that drew people to her immediately. Her smile was infectious, her laughter genuine, and she spoke with the confidence of someone far older. Rachel, quieter and more observant, seemed to exist in her sister's shadow, yet those who looked closely noticed that she often began sentences that Rebecca would finish, or answered questions directed at her sister before Rebecca had a chance to respond. What made the Morrison family particularly noteworthy among the circuit preachers was Ezekiel's reputation for bringing spiritual renewal to struggling congregations. Stories followed them from church to church, tales of backsliders returning to faith, of communities resolving long-standing conflicts, of spiritual awakenings that lasted for years after their departure. Some attributed this to Ezekiel's passionate preaching, but those who observed more carefully noticed that the real changes often began after private conversations with the twins. The journey to Pine Hollow had been particularly difficult. Late autumn rains had turned the mountain paths into treacherous mud, and Ezekiel had been forced to carry Rachel for the final 5 miles when she developed a fever. They arrived at sunset on November 15th, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips was concluding evening prayers with the handful of congregants who attended weeknight services. Phillips later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of profound weariness, not just physical but spiritual. Ezekiel's clothes were travel-stained and patched, his boots worn thin from countless miles of mountain paths. The girls clung close to their father, Rachel still pale from her fever, Rebecca's usual brightness dimmed by exhaustion. Yet something in their eyes, an alertness, an awareness that seemed inappropriate for children their age, made Phillips feel inexplicably uneasy. The congregation of Pine Hollow had extended hospitality to many traveling preachers over the years. But there was something different about the Morrisons from the very beginning. That first evening, as the family shared a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife about her garden, specifically inquiring whether the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that nearly killed them 3 summers ago. Mrs. Phillips had dropped her spoon, staring at the child in amazement. The rose blight had indeed occurred 3 years prior, devastating her prized flower garden, but it was not something she had mentioned to anyone outside the immediate community. When pressed, Rebecca simply smiled and said she had dreamed about roses while walking, and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the most beautiful ones in the county. This incident, recorded in Pastor Phillips's journal that very evening, would prove to be merely the first of many that would challenge everything the Pine Hollow community believed about the natural world. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the small cabin where the Morrison family had been given shelter. Pastor Phillips rose early, as was his custom, to prepare for the day's sermon. He found Ezekiel already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his Bible open, but his eyes staring into the distance with an expression of deep concern. "The girls had disturbing dreams last night," Ezekiel explained when Phillips inquired about his troubled demeanor. "They often dream of the places we're going to visit, but these dreams were different, darker." Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled from sleep, but her eyes alert and focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice, "in your church, beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed about why it's hidden." The pastor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had indeed hidden something beneath those exact floorboards, a bottle of whiskey that represented his ongoing struggle with temptation. Not a soul knew about it. He had placed it there during a moment of weakness 3 months prior, telling himself it was better to keep it close, where he could resist it daily, rather than to remove the temptation entirely. It was a secret that shamed him deeply, one he had confessed only to God in his private prayers. "What exactly did you dream, child?" Phillips asked, his voice barely steady. Rachel emerged from the shadows behind her sister, moving with that peculiar, silent grace that seemed to characterize her every action. "The bottle is brown," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket. A blue blanket." Phillips sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The cloth was indeed a remnant of a baby blanket. The blanket that would have belonged to the son he and his wife had lost in infancy 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a reminder of his failures, both as a father who couldn't save his child and as a pastor who couldn't conquer his own weaknesses. Ezekiel watched his host's reaction with an expression that mixed sympathy with a weary familiarity. "It started when they were very young," he explained quietly.